At 3:20 p.m. on the 21st of May 1946, an ambulance was called to a laboratory building in the Los Alamos nuclear weapons base. By the time the paramedics arrived, the patient, a scientist named Louis Slotin, was already suffering from vomiting and was convulsing with explosive diarrhea. It was the opening salvo of 9 days of unimaginable suffering. By the time he gets into the ambulance, his left hand has swollen to twice his size, and he complains to the paramedics that he can't get a sour taste out of his mouth. At the time, nobody had a true understanding of what was going to happen next for Slotin, but the doctors would soon find out. Once he arrives at the hospital, they plunge his swollen hand into ice water, but to no effect. Then blisters start to form under his skin, and then burst, never to heal again. Doctors pump his body with fresh blood to replace what's lost through the bleeding pustules. Despite receiving the finest medical care available at the time, Louis Slotin's condition would deteriorate rapidly, and as he laid on his bed, he began to decompose while still alive. You see, earlier that day, Slotin had received 4 times the lethal dose of radiation during an experiment which had gone horribly wrong. How? He'd been using a screwdriver to keep 2 beryllium spheres from clamping over a 6.2 kilogram plutonium core, but through nothing more than clumsy error or bad luck, he dropped the screwdriver, the spheres clamped shut, and a supercritical event began. Scientists observed a bright blue flash and a wave of heat wash over the room. Thinking quickly, Slotin knocked the beryllium core open with his left hand, stopping the reaction instantly. But the damage was already done. In less than a second, between 10 to 21 sieverts of radiation was poured into his body. By day 3, his extremities began to turn blue from cyanosis. Those blue patches then split open and bled. His blood is unable to coagulate by this stage, so the bleeding never properly stops. This then begins to happen inside his mouth. Before long, entire sections of his skin are peeling off. More blood is lost, more transfusions are given, 7 in total before he dies. By day 5, necrosis sets in, first in his arms and feet and then in the lining of his blood cells. By day 7, every stem cell in his bone marrow is gone. He suffers from jaundice, acute thrombosis, extreme epithelial damage in his intestines. His immune system becomes compromised as the radiation mutates his own DNA. He can't make any more white blood cells or red blood cells or any cells at all. The bacteria in his own stomach begins to attack his digestive system and surrounding organs as his immune system falls apart. Sepsis begins shortly after, then gangrene. Organs shut down, then tissue death. His bloodstream stops functioning properly, then liver failure, followed by total organ failure, and finally, death. He was suffering on the hospital bed for 9 days. But within hours of his death, Los Alamos doctors begin to perform an autopsy. See, they're curious about how radiation kills. At this stage, there's been no rigorous scientific investigation into radiation poisoning. As they slice him open, they are immediately confronted with a horrifying sight. The insides of Slotin's body looked unlike anything they'd ever seen before. It didn't resemble the organs and physiology of a human. What they saw was a mass of rotten flesh and partially decomposed organs, no longer separated by intramuscular tissue or fat, now simply a pile of biological refuse, like the messy floor of an abattoir. One large, indistinguishable, rotten organ sat in his torso cavity. He had died while decomposing from the inside out. Louis Slotin received between 10 to 20 sieverts of radiation and died what could easily be described as one of the worst deaths in human history. A sievert, by the way, is a unit to measure the biological effects of radiation on the human body. 1 sievert is definite radiation sickness, but most likely survivable. 5 sieverts is a 50% fatality rate within weeks. 10 sieverts is a guaranteed death sentence within hours or days. Louis Slotin may have received as much as 21 sieverts. When the first ever atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, those at ground zero would have received 50 sieverts of radiation. That was if they weren't instantly vaporized in the initial blast. Modern nuclear weapons can carry this dosage several kilometers away from the blast zone, meaning that a Louis Slotin-sized dose of radiation could be carried miles away from the intended target and shower the unsuspecting victims below with the same horrific symptoms, decomposing while still alive, that Slotin suffered. But that's the thing about nuclear weapons, isn't it? We often think that there's two ways to go. You're either lucky, and you're right under the explosion when it happens, which means you die before you even realise there was an explosion, or you're unlucky and you suffer a slow death from radiation. We don't have exact numbers, but estimates tell us that when the first nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima at 8:16 a.m. on August the 6th, 1945, somewhere between 100,000 and 160,000 people died. 20,000 of those people were instantly vaporized, and perhaps 30,000 died from acute radiation syndrome, which kind of begs the question, what happened to the rest of those fatalities, which by far makes up the biggest chunk? Well, this is where nuclear weapons get so much worse than you think. Most people died an unthinkably agonizing death from horrific trauma, which often took hours, sometimes days, to actually finish them off. See, the first stage of a nuclear explosion is the fireball. These are where most injuries come from, meaning that straight up conventional burns, not radiation, were responsible for at least 50% of all casualties in Hiroshima. Within 2 kilometers of the blast, skin ignites instantly, as well as anything else that can burn like plastic, wood, hair, clothes, and so on. Third-degree burns are common, sometimes charring flesh down to the muscle, often leading to a painful and drawn-out death by simple infection from the open wounds. After the fireball, though, comes the shock wave. This causes lungs to collapse, eardrums to rupture, and organs to fail from the sudden violent compression. People are thrown at high speeds into walls, cars, and debris, causing broken bones, skull fractures, spinal injuries, and impalements. Internal bleeding from broken ribs, torn organs, and crushed limbs kill many who survived the initial explosion and fireball. Some are unlucky enough to be caught in both the initial fireball and then the subsequent shockwave, meaning that their skin burns and melts, and then the following blast is strong enough to tear their molten skin right off their body, essentially flaying people alive. But it's not just people who can't stand up to the blast. Buildings and infrastructure collapse, trapping people under rubble. Sharp debris like glass, metal and wood are launched into the air at lethal speeds, causing decapitations, amputations, impalements, and deep cuts to major blood vessels, leaving people half charred, smashed to pieces, and bleeding out wherever they lay. Those trapped under rubble die from suffocation or crushing rather than radiation exposure. And then after the initial blast comes the secondary fire, which happened in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki and saw mass deaths as these fires ripped through collapsed buildings, exposed wood, and shredded clothing, some of which was blasted directly off of people's bodies in the shockwave. Those trapped under their houses are roasted alive in the flames. For those that survive, smoke inhalation burns the sensitive lining of the lungs, causing internal suffocation over days. Most of those who make up the estimated 30,000 dead from radiation exposure actually already had major burns, lost limbs, blindness, exposed wounds, and so on, all of which exacerbate the likelihood and intensity of sickness from radiation exposure. None of this is to say that radiation is a trivial concern in regards to nuclear weapons. It's still extremely dangerous, but in terms of actual casualty proportions, it pales in comparison to the sheer proportion of those who are roasted alive, smashed to pieces, suffocated, crushed, and impaled, often surrounded by their friends or family as they witness each other endure this unimaginable fate. Now, all of this is bad enough, but it still gets worse, because what you have to bear in mind with a nuclear explosion is that it doesn't just destroy people and buildings. It also destroys infrastructure, communications, and access to basic resources, meaning that those who are lucky enough to survive are now almost completely on their own. Help isn't coming. To make my point about this, I want to share the example of the Red Cross Hospital in Hiroshima, which was one of the only medical centres in the city to stay standing after the blast. And I say standing, but it wasn't unscathed. The hospital remained only partially operational, most of the staff died in the blast, and most of the hospital building was lost in a firestorm. Those remaining medical staff were themselves injured and confused and had lost most of their medical supplies to the explosion. Within hours of the blast, though, they were under an avalanche of survivors, covered in third-degree burns, vomiting from radiation sickness, and carrying limbs that were blown off in the initial explosion. One man was guided to the hospital by another survivor, and when he got there, he reported to the doctors, holding his own eyeballs in his hands. On a typical day, the Red Cross Hospital Hiroshima would treat between 200 to 300 patients throughout the entire day. By 5 p.m. on the day of the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima, they were completely overwhelmed, with a staggering 12,000 patients, more severely injured than anything they'd ever seen, and with less than half their usual staff, no clean water, and minimal equipment. Dr. Tatsuichio Akizuki, a doctor at the hospital, wrote in his memoir that the hospital turned into a hell, with many survivors wandering in a daze, skin hanging off their bodies, eyes swollen shut, and faces melted. Another doctor named Sasaki, a surgeon, was forced to perform improvised amputations without anesthetic and make heartbreaking decisions about who to help and who to leave for dead, and there were a lot of dead. So many, in fact, that patients couldn't get to doctors because the hallways were piled with hundreds of corpses from people that had died from their injuries while waiting for help. A flood of vomit, excrement, blood, and melted flesh began to make what little remained of the hospital unusable. And again, that's before we even think about radiation, which would go on to claim a lot of those patients and hospital staff that were fighting so hard for survival during the opening hours of the bombing. It gets even more terrifying when you consider the fact that Hiroshima was a single bombing with an atomic bomb. Of course, yeah, Nagasaki came 3 days later, but you could describe these as more or less separate events. Today, however, the nuclear strategy of most major nations would not be to drop a series of atomic bombs one by one on different cities over several consecutive days, but instead to unleash their entire arsenal of hydrogen bombs at once towards the enemy. And by the way, each one of these is up to 80 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, meaning that if a nuclear war were to actually break out now, it wouldn't just be your city that got smashed into oblivion, but every other major city or military installation you can think of, meaning that unlike in Hiroshima, where Japan was able to try and gather a nationwide humanitarian response, a modern-day nuclear war would be so destructive that there would be no help coming from anywhere. Not in a couple of hours, not in a couple of days, not ever. And then, of course, we have the centuries of radiation and ecosystem destruction, the nuclear winter, the genetic mutations, the breakdown of law and order, the mass crop failures, the likelihood that after the nuclear winter, all of these corpses that had frozen would defrost in the new sunlight and give rise to a horde of insects, spreading even more disease and a damaged ozone layer that forces the Stone Age survivors underground. To quote the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, it would be a world in which the living would envy the dead. But hey, the speculation of a nuclear apocalypse is a subject for another video. This one was just on nuclear weapons, which, I would argue, are worse than you thought.